aren't around in our particular geography. I would mention by preface that we're holding this on Teams instead of Zoom for various reasons, but one of the drawbacks of Teams is that they have not yet created rooms. So we were hoping, you might have seen that the agenda slightly changed, because we were hoping that we would divide everybody into small groups for the second half of this session, and we're not able to do that. So we tweaked the second half, and it's going to be more a sort of structured brainstorm with us all. Just let somebody else in. So the first part, we've got some presentations, and I'm really grateful to Mary and Katie for joining us to talk about how we provide and support employment for people who are leaving prison. Mary is a senior employer and partnership manager for East Anglia at the DWP and the lead for prisons and ex-offenders. I'm afraid, Katie, I don't have your job title, but I see it says HMP Norwich under your name, but we'll come back to that in just a second. And then I'm really grateful to Vicky Day, who's the head of prevention and rehabilitation at the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner for Norfolk, for the second part of our presentations, which is going to be talking a bit more about how we provide homes. Very much homes and jobs have to be linked up to be a success. I can't provide one without the other. And that's why it's so important that we're all on this call, and we're all, I'm taking it by being on this call, committed to helping find some solutions. After the presentations, we'll have a quick Q&A of any specific questions to our speakers. And then we will take, and I've learned this from past experience, a natural break. I will say it's 5 minutes. I will expect everyone to be back in no more than 10 minutes, because otherwise we'll lose the whole afternoon. And then we're going to do this sort of collective brainstorm. What do we, those of us on the call, need to do, and what's getting in our way? I think with over 20 people on the call, hopefully the hands up when you want to speak will work, but if people could use a text chat function to make comments, or if you think that those of us who are trying to run the session are ignoring you and your hands put up, say you want to ask a question in chat, because it could be quite complicated at that point. Because I'm really keen that everyone gets the chance to both ask and answer questions, and also to make comments, because actually with all of our organisations on the call at the same time, it's a fantastic opportunity to share ideas and experience, and maybe break down some barriers. The aim is to finish no later than 2:45. I will be willing to slip a couple of minutes on that, but I'm very conscious that most people have back-to-back meetings nowadays, and there's probably 3 o'clock meetings that people will need to get to as well. So to give you time to do that. I would ask, if possible, that you keep your camera on. It's very difficult as a speaker if you actually you're just talking to a blank screen, but could everybody mute yourselves when you're not speaking? I think I've covered all the housekeeping. I thought we would do a round robin, and I'm going to invite Paula to facilitate this by just going down her list of everyone who's here. And if you could just say your name, your job title, and the organisation you're here from, as opposed to anything greater, because otherwise with so many on the call, we'll lose another half hour. I'll start it, Paula, by saying I'm Michael Newey. I'm Chief Exec of Broadland Housing Association and a board member of Homes for Cathy. And I'm now going to mute for a moment.
Daryl Smith.
Hi, I'm Dara Smith. I'm the Operations Director for the YMCA. So YMCA Norfolk, working primarily with under 25s, but we're also a partner of Pathways, the Rough Sleeping Partnership across Norwich.
Okay, Joe Todd.
Hello, I'm Jo Todd. I work for Victory Housing as Partnership Manager.
Julie Everson.
Hi, I'm Julia Everson. I'm Head of Hopestead, which is Flagship Group's commitment to ending homelessness in the East.
Katie.
Katie, I'm a prison work coach at HMP Norwich, but I work for the Department for Work and Pensions.
Leon.
Yep, hi, Leon McLaughlin-Smith. I'm one of the co-heads for Norfolk and Suffolk Probation Service.
Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie Burdett. I work for Shelter. I'm the hub manager.
Lisa.
Hello everyone, it's Lisa from North Norfolk District Council Housing Options Manager.
Simon.
Hi, I'm Simon Leher. I'm the Communications Manager for Chorus Homes, part of Places for People.
Sue.
Sue Stavers, Clarion Housing Group. I'm Group Homelessness Lead for the whole group, but I head up operations for Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, Lincs and Northants.
Vicky.
Hello, Vicky Day from the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office in Norfolk.
Maria.
Hi, I'm Director of Homeless Services for St Martin's and Contract Manager for Pathways Norwich.
Karen.
Hi everybody, I'm Karen Lohman. I'm Director of Operations at Colchester Borough Homes.
Paul.
Hi, Paul Kingston, Director of Housing and Care at Orwell and also board member at Estuary Housing.
Tanya.
Hi, Tanya Rayner, Housing Options Service Manager at Great Yarmouth Borough Council.
Nikki.
Hi, yeah, Nikki Patton, Housing Strategy Manager at the Borough Council of Kings Lynn in West Norfolk.
Ross.
Hi, I'm Ross Hefford. I'm the Housing Options Manager at Kings Lynn Council.
Okay, Catherine.
I'm Executive Housing Director at Broadland and I owe Ross an email, so I was just scribbling down email Ross after this finishes. Sorry, Ross.
Katie.
I think I also owe Ross an email that Carla's copied me into, so I will write that down also. But I'm Katie from Broadland Housing Association and I'm the local delivery manager in the West.
And then we have Bernie.
Sorry, Bernie Sheehan, Digital Content Officer in the comms team at Broadland.
Rebecca.
Rebecca King, also from Broadland. I'm the Corporate Communications Assistant.
And I'm Paula. I'm the Corporate, the Communications and Tenant Participation Manager at Broadland. I think that was everybody. I'm not sure if I missed anyone. I think Mary, you're the only person that I didn't call out, maybe, but you're going to be presenting in 30 seconds. So.
Sorry, Mary. So before I hand over, can I let everyone know that we are recording this session? I know that the internet can dip in and out, and therefore if you miss a bit, we will have a recording available afterwards, but just be aware that it is being recorded. And if you desperately don't want your face to appear, feel free to turn off your camera, but it'd be really good if you could leave your camera on. And with that, I'm going to mute myself in a second and I'm going to hand over to Mary and Katie.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me along today. I'm going to give you a little brief background of the prison work coach role and the roles and responsibilities that DW have to supporting ex-offenders as they go from prison into the community and hopefully find work. So I have 17 years of experience working with ex-offenders myself and a wide variety of different roles within that. So I have been a prison work coach myself. And I line manage the prison work coaches before, and as we've moved on, I've now got the East Anglia League service delivery side of prisons within East Anglia. So our district manager, Julia Nix, I think has, as a district manager, has got the most prisons under her command. So she thinks she's been very naughty in a previous life, but nevertheless, it sort of helps build a better understanding of all the different sorts of services that happen in all the different sorts of prisons. We have a female prison, we have local prisons, we have Cat C prisons, and we have Whitemoor being a high security prison. So it really helps us understand the journey that offenders travel through. One of the things I learned really early on was to really listen to the individual and to understand what they felt would help them with their reoffending behaviour and their journey from custody into the community. And my thoughts were very much about reacting to what they felt their journey should be, as opposed to us inflicting a journey on them. And whilst I fully appreciate there needs to be lots of key stakeholder involvement in that journey, I still felt that the journey was held by the individual. And I've had many challenging conversations around work as somebody comes out of custody, and is that the right time, and how people present different in prison to the way they present in the community. But I still felt very strongly that the thing that we should focus on is trying to support the individual on their journey and how they felt as they stepped into custody, from custody into the community. And quite a few men in custody, because this is mainly based from Norwich Prison, told me and told my team that work was the answer to their problems. And so very quickly we decided that DWP decided that the way to find work was to engage with employers and to bring employers into the prison. At that point, you remove the barrier around disclosure. It becomes less of a tricky conversation and a scary conversation for the individual to talk to an employer about the nature of their offence if they are in custody. And it removes those barriers. And we found that very successful. So with the help of Vicky Day and the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office, we set up a programme called Gateway to Employment, which helped and encouraged employers to get involved. And it was quite successful. Our next challenge was to talk to offenders about what we call the ABC of work. So it's a job that will lead to a better job and hopefully a career in a job. So it's setting your expectations at the right level. It's very rare that you're going to go from custody into the community with your dream job. And we need to help our offenders understand that a job is probably the best place to start. We also needed to look really carefully at the barriers that the offenders had. And very often accommodation was one of those barriers. We looked at different routes and different funding streams to see whether we could help support some of the accommodation barriers around funding, around rent deposits, around first month's rent payment, and all of those other things. And we were kindly supported by the previous High Sheriff Charles Watt to develop a bursary fund of money that could remove some of those barriers. That fund still continues and it's held with Norfolk Foundation. And it's still available for anybody in a position where they have a job, but they do not have accommodation. This can be accessed through a referral to Cathy, and we will then look at all the key criteria to see whether the person meets those criteria and then access that funding as appropriate if it's the right thing to do. There are a panel that approves that access to that fund as well. So it's quite straightforward, it's quite easy and it's quite quick, which is really beneficial for this situation. And I think the best way to describe what we've tried to achieve is to look at two scenarios. One is a scenario that happened a while back, just last year, and one is a scenario that's now an ongoing scenario as we speak. And so the one I'm going to talk to you about is a man called R, that's how I'm going to refer to him as. And then Katie will talk to you about a scenario that she has and she's dealing with right now as we all speak. So R came into custody in 2018 in January for crimes relating to drug addiction. He came into custody and whilst in custody he was stabbed and he spent a month in hospital. He started work in the prison, he was given a job which he really enjoyed and he did incredibly well with this job, and he was quite quickly promoted to becoming one of the orderlies, which is a trusted prisoner within the prison system, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of. As he moved through his sentence, he started to engage with our prison work coaches. So Katie and Claire and Rachel are my prison work coaches in Norwich Prison, and he started to talk about his desire to go into work, how much he enjoyed the purpose of getting up for work in the mornings whilst he was in custody, how much he enjoyed his tasks that were set for him, and he felt like he had a purpose in life, and he wanted to continue to do that as he left custody and went into the community. He also felt that having a job was the key to him changing his life, and we listened very carefully to all the barriers that he presented with. We arranged for one interview with one employer that comes into the prison on a regular basis, and unfortunately he wasn't successful with that application. But the prison work coaches continued to search for a job for him. At this point, he was then introduced to another employer, and I'm quite proud to say that I'm allowed to tell you who that employer is because they are quite keen to promote this story. So it's a company called Timpson's, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And Timpson's came into the prison and they interviewed R and gave him a job on the spot for him to actually leave custody and start work with, which was phenomenal. So then we had to look at all the other barriers. One of the barriers was the fact that R was a low risk offender and didn't have any accommodation. So we accessed the bursary fund, and we were able to provide him with short-term bed and breakfast while we continued to search for him to get more permanent stable accommodation straight after his release. Unfortunately, for various reasons, which there's lots of detail behind, which we don't really need to go into too deeply, the day before his release, he was told he was no longer allowed to live in Norwich and he had to go to Ipswich. At which point you can see the decline of his situation was just whipped from under his feet. So at this particular point, I had a very upset customer on my hands and a very upset work coach who felt they had done everything right, but had led this customer to feel so desperate at this point. So explaining to my work coach, a lady called Rachel, that we don't give up at this point. We'll go back to the employer and just ask whether we could park that job and revisit that job when R came out of his approved premises accommodation in Ipswich. Timpsons were absolutely amazing, I have to say. And they said not only would they not park the job, they would transfer the job to Ipswich so he could start the job in Ipswich. So he started the job in Ipswich on his release. The day before he was due to start the job, he planned his journey. He had no concept of Ipswich at all. He didn't know the area at all. And he planned his journey and he walked down to the branch where he was going to be working at, and he introduced himself to all the people that he was going to be working with the next day. He continued to work there whilst in approved premises, which is really expensive, and he didn't earn hardly any money because of the accommodation costs, etc. But he had a long-term goal in his mind, and he continued to believe that work was his answer and his way out of his offending behaviour. He carried on working there, and he then got to the point where the approved premises time was going to be spent, and he wanted to come back to Norfolk, which he did. He continued to work with Rachel, his prison work coach, and we then accessed the bursary fund again to get him temporary bed and breakfast accommodation back into Norfolk. He transferred his job and he continued to work in a Timpsons branch in Norfolk whilst living at the bed and breakfast accommodation. Throughout this whole journey, his wife had got a restraining order out against him. But his wife had heard about his job and made contact with him, and to cut a very long story short, the restraining order was lifted.
Yeah, okay, I'm in now.
So where we are now is the fact that he still continues to work. His wife has accepted him back into the family.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
And he has had a promotion. So an amazing story by the power of listening to one person who felt that work was their way through this journey and to reduce their reoffending behaviour. So I'm going to hand over to Katie, and Katie will just run through a scenario that's happening, like I say, as we speak now, for somebody who's left custody fairly recently and the position that they now find themselves in with their job. So Katie, over to you.
Hi, so we have a chap who I'm going to refer to with T. This wasn't his first time in custody. He's been in custody about 3 or 4 times previously, and he's just finished serving 18 months of a 36-month sentence for a violent crime. He was released back in August. At the end of August, he was released on bank holiday weekend as well. He was due to this, and he would have had no support. Obviously, due to the pandemic, it was a little bit harder to get everything sorted, but the prison were really supportive. And we had a father in the chaplaincy who supported T and helped us to find accommodation. T was also accepted to be part of our project as well, that's ran with the ex-Vice Sheriff of Norfolk that Mary spoke about a minute ago. So we managed to secure him supported housing in a shared house. He is still living there at the moment, and the mentor from the project has also supported T into finding himself full-time employment. He is currently painting pipes. It is a temporary contract, however, they've actually said it's an ongoing contract, and by the time they've finished painting the pipes, it's very likely that they'll need to start again as there's miles of them. So that's quite positive. He seems to be really enjoying himself, and he actually did a little bit of overtime as well. So that's really positive. They actually really like him in the supported shed house as well, because he's built them a shed. He's been doing some gardening work with them as well, and they've got some chickens in the garden. Apparently he's been helping with the chickens too, which is quite nice. He's obviously now in proper work and is looking to the project is helping him with budgeting skills as well, to help him to save up to move into his own rented accommodation. And he's been constantly supported throughout the whole process by myself and the mentor, and is now doing really well for himself. The first few months post-release are absolutely crucial, because quite a high percentage of people can be recalled during those first few months, but because he's had that level of support, he's done really well for himself. He's got somewhere to live and a full-time job.
Thank you, Katie. And so I kind of think that our question is, how can we move people with a job into affordable affordable accommodation at the point that they need it, which is usually quite tricky when they have either a low-paid, low-skilled job while they work through. The individuals are very often very well skilled, but the jobs that they take on initially are those ABC jobs, those lower skilled jobs, to get them onto the jobs market. So how can we support them to find accommodation at the right time and encourage them to continue this crime-free life where they actually have a purpose and they go to work every day? So that's all I'm going to say at the moment. I think we've got some other people coming in to speak now as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary and Katie. That was really useful, and I think that I will be fascinated at a later time to find out how we can also help on the employment side. But I think you've summed up the big ask for many of us on this call, which is how do we find people homes to live in when they leave prison with a job to go to. Shall we move now to Vicky from the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office, who's going to talk about a project and may draw on something from Catherine Little from Broadland or not, I'm not sure. But over to you, Vicky, if I may.
Thank you, Michael. And like Tanya, I'm having some concerns about my network dipping in and dipping out, and also my phone is making some bizarre noises too. So if it's okay with everyone and acceptable to everyone, I'll just leave my camera off for now because I'm feeling a bit nervous while I'm presenting that you might lose me at some point, but I will go for it now. And thank you, Mary and Katie. That was really helpful and a fantastic introduction. And yes, at the end, I may ask Catherine, Maria or Leon if they've got anything that they want to add or if I've missed anything as I go along. But what I'd like to do, and I'm really sorry, I don't mean to patronise anyone in any way, shape or form, but I think it might be helpful if we went back to March, when we first went into this lockdown, our first lockdown period, because that will help in terms of the background of where we managed to get to in terms of this project, if that's acceptable to everyone. So people who were homeless and sleeping rough, typically, I guess, in the high risk group for COVID-19, many of those people have long-term health conditions that can result in some severe consequences should they or a member of staff providing support become infected with the virus. And many of them have long-term conditions that can also mask COVID-19, making it really difficult to identify the virus within people who are homeless or sleeping rough. In addition, they were unable to follow public health guidelines around hand washing and hygiene, and a number of community hubs and facilities closed. because social distancing was not possible, and people needed to self-isolate too. So as we're all aware, in March, I think it was towards the end of March, the government wrote to all the councils in the UK instructing them to immediately house those in their communities who are sleeping rough in response to the pandemic. And Norfolk Partners pulled together a working group very quickly, and it's to everyone's credit really. And the group was called the Self-Isolation for Transient and Vulnerable Persons Working Group. And the idea of the group was to identify and coordinate provision of self-contained accommodation for those unable to self-isolate, including but not limited to those people who are rough sleeping, including those men and women who were being released from prison or discharged from hospital. And it also included the travelling community and those who were in temporary accommodation. In addition to all of the above measures, at the same time, the Ministry of Justice and Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service were doing everything they possibly could and implementing measures to limit the spread and impact of the virus in the prison estate, to protect the health of staff and prisoners, maintain safety and order, and minimise the impact of the pandemic on the NHS. So therefore, very early on into the pandemic, it was early April, there was a scheme released called the End of Custody Temporary Release Scheme. And this scheme was enabling risk-assessed prisoners who were within a couple of months of their release date to be temporarily released from custody as part of a national approach to managing public services during the challenging period. And separately from this process, some prisoners also met the criteria for potential compassionate releases, for example, women in the female estate who were pregnant, or men or women who were extremely medically vulnerable to COVID-19. And in addition to the compassionate releases too, there was also men and women being released as business as usual from the prison estate. So the Self-Isolation and Transient Vulnerable Persons Working Group very quickly looked at the demand and sourcing supply, and looking at data, projecting into the future really, what releases might look like. And we ascertained very quickly that Norwich Prison releases were going to be making up approximately 30% of future demand across Norwich City during this particular time frame. And that was a real concern for us locally. And I think when we think about the case studies that Mary presented to us this afternoon, in terms of prisoner releases, regardless of their other release arrangements, it is essential that former offenders are often at high risk of returning to addiction, gang activity, and crime post-release if housing cannot be found. Some former offenders will have multiple and complex needs, and wraparound services were not widely available and continue not to be. And hostels were at capacity, and it was felt that a longer term solution was needed and was being felt certainly across Norwich. So we also worked really closely, and our probation colleagues did, to look at exceptional delivery models in terms of men and women who are being released from custody, how to best support them and enhance their through the gates provision. And that was really difficult and problematic insofar as being able to have that face-to-face contact and support, and again, that wraparound support coming through the gate, which is absolutely crucial. So based on all of these factors and thinking about where Norwich Prison is located, right in the middle of the city, that we have Bishopsbridge House was at capacity, and we felt it was essential at that point to develop some kind of role across Norwich City based on all the information and literature that we had at our hands and fingertips at that point. So therefore, the OPCCN decided that it wanted to commission a person-centred support officer to help those men and women who have been in prison to settle back into the local communities, to help those that are at risk of offending or re-offending from committing crimes, and reduce the number of people who become victims of crime. And the main features of this person-centred support officer is to make sure that we weren't duplicating any other projects or initiatives, but to complement existing provision, working in partnership. The person-centred support officer's role is to also engage with many people in the communities and different projects to pool resources together, but recognising that the people they're working with who are, you know, sometimes in deep trouble, disaffected, judged, depressed and anxious, affected by troubled family relationships, as Mary's explained to us, or suffering from drug misuse issues and at great risk from COVID-19. And also it was really important that the person-centred support officer works alongside other organisations such as the National Probation Service, police, CGL, DWP, etc. So it's really trying to look for a local response to local problems, encouraging the individuals themselves to try and take some control of their lives, and providing better stability from which goals can be easily progressed, with the long-term aim of achieving desistance. So as we were commissioning the post, we were really fortunate to be having conversations with our probation colleagues, and they could really see the benefits in what we were trying to achieve. And consequently, they match funded our cash contribution to the project, which then meant a service or a project that was running for 1 year could now be delivered for 2 years. And we're really grateful to have that partnership with our probation colleagues. And we sought the support from St Martin's Housing and commissioned St Martin's Housing to actually deliver the contract based on a number of reasons, and predominantly because there are links to Pathways and Bishopsbridge House, their experience of working with men and women coming through the gate, especially those men coming through the gate from the adult estate from Norwich Prison. So we're thrilled to be working with St Martin's Housing on this particular project. As this project was taking off, we were also approached by our colleagues from Norwich City Council, so Chris Hancock and Catherine Little from Broadland Housing, who were also working very innovatively and creatively to look at how we can support the really hard to reach men and women who are constantly revolving around the gates or present as a high risk due to potentially MAPA reasons. And in essence, the project has grown from not just providing the support, but actually now purchasing 10 one-bedroomed properties. And these 10 one-bedroom properties will provide that aspiration and hope and provide a place of permanence, a home of permanence, and not to constantly see men and women transitioning through accommodation. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, and that we're really grateful that anyone can have a home, but I think as a group we felt it was really important that somebody had a place that they could call home and actually settle somewhere and have that job and progress in a job and be part of a community and feel part of a community and contribute to a community. So where we are now then, we have a very small project group. Our project group is made up of Catherine, Chris Hancock, Paul Reeve, Leon McLaughlin-Smith, our colleagues from Norwich Prison, so Martin Edwards and St Martin's housing at this moment in time. And as and when we stumble across problems or blockages, we start pulling in those relevant partners that we need to into that project group to do a bit of that kind of brainstorming that Michael talked about earlier today. So the project mobilised really quickly and really well. We have a clear referral pathway. We have a communication strategy in place. We have all the necessary evaluation tools, and we'll be using case studies, service users, questionnaires, feedback, and using the Housing Outcomes Star. A robust case management and reporting system in place. And now that our person-centred support officer's in place, MC, she's probably known to a number of you already. She already has a caseload of 10 clients, 6 of which have already been identified for accommodation. And it is her intention to join the project group and bring along the cases with her to the project group to really understand the individuals who want to support and where some of their barriers still exist and how we as a project group can work innovatively and differently to support the individuals. I think we've mobilised very well, as I've said. I think some of the difficulties we now face, or the only sort of like difficulty at this moment in time, is making sure that the accommodation themselves comes online, and it comes online a little bit more quickly than is presently. And I think some of the issues around the accommodation, a mistake that we probably made at the outset was setting the criteria for the accommodation. It was maybe too stringent. So, for example, initially we said we want 10 one-bedroom properties all on lower ground to make sure we have the equality of opportunity. But having spent some time reviewing all of the caseload and potential clients for this particular intervention, it is evident that actually ground floor isn't necessarily crucial, and actually there are means and mechanisms to make sure that accommodation is accessible for anybody that needs to use it. So we've made those little adaptations, so hopefully it will make our search a little bit easier going forward. I'll shut up there actually, and then invite either Catherine or Maria or Leon to comment on the project as key partners too.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to, I'm going to pick on Leon to go first with some comments, then I'll go to Maria, then I'll go to Catherine.
Yep, thanks Michael. Thanks Vicky, that's quite a comprehensive summary I think of where the project's at the moment. Just to echo really what Vicky said about probation's commitment to work collaboratively to try to ensure that we're effectively accommodating those most in need from our offending group. We all know, don't we, that I think even going back to the days of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's as valid now as it was then. Michael and a couple other people already commented on that accommodation and employment goes hand in hand. And for us, accommodation is absolutely critical. And it's not just finding accommodation, it's having accommodation with a sense of a longer term tenancy. Many of our service users for probation will come out of prison, and a number of them will find their way into an approved premise, which Mary spoke about earlier. That's not long-term accommodation, and it's not stable accommodation. If anything, all we're doing is increasing the period of time that a service user is anxious about having a roof over their heads. And for those where actually that immediate concern is addressed, actually we're just putting the inevitable off, because again within 12 weeks time they're faced with the real fear of being homeless. So to have accommodation units where actually somebody can call it a home and can set themselves up in a home. That's a really positive step forward. Early days for the project, but very promising initial sort of start, and really keen to see how it continues to develop. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. Can I go to Maria from St Martin's?
Yeah, I can just reiterate what Leon said, really, because actually that security of tenure is absolutely critical. I think many of the people that we want to reach here, the offenders that we want to reach and we're sort of targeting, are those that are revolving around the system, and they do that because of that insecurity of tenure. When they're going into hostels and sort of supported housing projects, they bounce around, and that means it just, especially if they continue offending because of the environment. So it's really about giving that security their own front door, I think, which is really important. The other second point, I think, the reason I think this will be so successful is that link with the Pathways Norwich service, because of all of the wraparound support that comes with it, because of all the specialisms that are sitting within that team around mental health, welfare rights, all sorts of things that are in there, which will be able to support MC in her endeavours, in her work with the individual. So alongside obviously other agencies, but I think it's just a little bit of a bonus, really. But very good project, and very pleased to be part of it.
Super. And Catherine, have you got anything to add?
There's not much more to say, is there? Just to echo the importance of an assured tenancy. People who go into their home as part of this project, it is their home. They will be treated tenancy-wise as any other tenant with an assured tenancy. It's interesting, though, the conversation I've been having with the team is just how we make sure they're skilled up and linked in with a support provider to make sure that we manage the tenancies appropriately, and that we are linking in with MC to make sure that people are really well supported. A couple of figures from the business case for this project, because I think it's staggering, really. In 2019-20, 78 people sleeping on the streets of Norwich were ex-offenders. A cohort of 53 people, and Maria probably did the analysis here, so she's smiling. 53 people showed essentially that the current system is keeping them in a revolving cycle of offending, street homelessness, institution, and then back onto the street. So this really is about breaking a cycle, and as Mary and Katie really well expressed, seeing what individuals need to establish a really successful life, successful tenancy, and hopefully to find work or whatever it is they need to be successful in their lives. I want to finish just by saying what an absolute privilege it has been to be part of this project because of the partnership. Norwich City are contributing through some funding and significantly through time and effort. We'll be providing the properties, which is challenging. And Sue, you're quite right. We need to make sure we don't end up bidding against each other for the next steps, accommodation, this accommodation, and so on. And that is a challenge for us. We don't want to be, artificially inflating the market by snapping up all the one-bed flats quickly in an area. So it is challenging. And we do need the right quality. It's not just about buying anything, as Vicky said. We need to have some tolerance for different properties, but we also need to make sure they are really, decent quality, decent homes that people can have as a home.
Much indeed. We've heard quite a bit in the last 40 minutes or so. And I've scribbled 3.5 pages of notes, and I'm sure that the team have scribbled some more for later. I think the fact that housing is so clearly been demonstrated as being the barrier that offenders have in sort of re-establishing their lives, and how employment is only so good if you haven't got a home. I love the phrase that Vicky had, which was local response to local problems. And I also like the reference to, if we stumble across problems and blockages, we do the brainstorm. What I'm keen that we should do with the time after our quick break in a moment is actually to think about, can we foresee problems and blockages that between us we can find solutions to? So I'm hoping people are using the chat function. No one stuck their hand up. I'll sort of have a few moments for some questions directly to our speakers, if anybody wants to ask a specific question to our speakers. No one is waving that strange yellow hand at me that appears on Teams. Oh, Catherine, she's just had an opportunity to talk and she's right back with a question.
I wanted to come back to Mary, actually. You hear Timpson's being name-checked quite a lot in terms of doing some fantastic work around employing people leaving prison and ex-offenders, and really recognising, you know, it's about the person. And your story there was just, I mean, I can't say gobsmacking on a record seminar, can I? But I just
It's
have.
just been recorded, yeah.
In many ways, not least, you know, the flexibility that Timpson showed. I just wondered, are there other employers and are there opportunities for local employers to step up? What would you want to see from us, I guess?
Yeah, we have a wide range of different employers. We have some small employers. You know, I know of one employer that actually only employs 4 people and took an ex-offender on many years ago and continues to have that ex-offender, you know, in their workforce. One person out of a workforce of 4 is 25% of their workforce. So it's incredible. And it's not about the or where the placements come from. It's about the right thing at the right time for the individual and for the employer. So we do have quite a few employers that just do this literally under the radar. They don't really want to be mentioned too widely for various reasons, best known to themselves. But we do have lots of employers that actually don't mind, you know, having their names spoken about. Their employers, you know, that are quite open about this. We fairly recently, just this week, we actually had a contact to one of the prison work coaches that had heard about the new Kickstart scheme and said, I'm not too bothered about Kickstart, although if that meant that there was an opportunity to do something for ex-offenders, I'd be more interested. But my main interest is really, what can I do to help this disadvantaged group that are even further disadvantaged because of today's situation? Because at the moment, the labour market is flooded with lots of people that have just newly found themselves unemployed. And, you know, for obvious reasons, they present to an employer in probably a better situation than some of the ex-offenders will do. They are oven-ready, job-ready people. And if an employer wants a fairly quick fix to an employment need, they tend to sort of like put some of the more disadvantaged people further down the queue. Now, whether we think that's right or wrong is a fact. But we can't leave anybody behind, and we actually increase our profile with this customer group now more than ever, because they need us more than ever now to actually have a voice in the labour market. And so our work with ex-offenders has not gone away, and in fact, if anything, it's more important than ever.
Yeah. Thank you. Carolyn, you've got a comment or question.
Oh, hi. Yeah. It's fantastic to hear about this project. I'm Carolyn Howell. I'm from Solo Housing. Sorry I was late joining. Bit of an IT issue today. I just wondered if at some point during the meeting it would be okay if we can update the group on the project we're setting up for women offenders coming out of Peterborough Prison in terms of accommodation and support.
Why don't you do that now?
Okay. Yeah, I just we've had an initial meeting with St Martin's about some joint working with this, but we've been working together with South Norfolk and Broadland councils and the CRC and probation. Well, it feels like quite some time now. Some things have got a bit delayed because of COVID, etc. But way back when, there was a need identified for women being released from Peterborough Prison who actually wanted to return to South Norfolk and Broadland district. So we've been doing some work to set up a support project, which is basically accommodation-based support, which would be integrated into our wider support services for up to 6 women. We've been with Saffron, who have been working with us to provide the accommodation. We're just at the point now where we've secured 2 units so far of the 6 that we need to secure, and hopefully within the next month we'll be moving the first 2 women into that accommodation. We've got a grant from Nationwide Foundation to come.
I think we've just lost you. Is it just me?
No, we've lost her.
We've lost her. Okay,
Yeah,
that's really unfortunate. But we can come back to that. What I'm going to suggest is now coming up to 5 to 2. We'll take a very quick 5-minute break if anyone is desperate for a natural break, and then at 2 o'clock we'll come back and we start working through what we can do. What do we need to do? What gets in the way? What are the blockages that we can foresee? If people can put questions into the chat as well as raise their hand, it should make sure that we clear everybody contribution by 2:45. So we'll start again very promptly at 2 o'clock with whoever is on the screen at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Obviously, MAPA have been waiting with that offer of a grant for quite some time, so I just want to get moving on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, but then I'll feed back how it goes. So
Yeah,
then
you keep us in the loop, won't you?
Yeah, of course.
Maybe it's worth penciling in an update into the new year, Maria, and just see even a couple of months in how it's going, and maybe things will have calmed down a bit for the development team.
I won't have it by then. I'm having to do a decant in 2 properties into a much larger property. So I won't actually be able to start until about February. So if we look at, the start of the financial year, we can then start to really have a look. So I'll make sure I keep in touch with you on it.
Yeah, of course, that's fine. But that's really helpful to know kind of timescale you're thinking of. Thank you.
Because I know you're busy with all the other properties.
It is a nice problem to have, isn't it? That there's actually some money going into secure accommodation and support for people. So, we're certainly not grumbling.
No.
We're gently repopulating the screen. I said we would start very promptly at 2 o'clock, and it is now 2 o'clock. And in theory, we still have 21 or 22 people still on the call, but not so many cameras activated right now. I think the question about what do we need to do and what's getting in the way of us doing it is probably the key question. I don't know whether anybody wants to have a go at answering that. Be interested to know, Mary, actually, because you've got the broader experience, how much are housing associations and local authority housing providers part of the problem, and how much are we part of the solution? In other words, do we create problems to make sure that we aren't part of the solution?
It's so tricky that it's like lining up all your ducks, and you only have to have one duck that decides it's going to go off in a different direction to the rest of the ducks, and all the ducks then go off into a different world. So it's very much a case of the scenarios that you can find someone leaving custody with a job and then going back to all the housing providers, and Maria and I and loads of different housing providers have had loads of conversations where you cannot, to get all of those ducks in that line to find the best outcome is the hardest part of the journey. Yeah. So we overcame the barrier around funding for rent deposits, etc., by the very, really generous scheme that the previous High Sheriff started off, which still is there and available. And it's a non-refundable scheme as well. But in amongst all of that, having the finances then isn't just the only solution, because not only do you have to have the finances, you have to have the property. And along with that comes all the other things around, people needing guarantees and things like that. So it's a tricky thing to do. I think temporary accommodation, when somebody is really motivated that a job is the answer to them and their offending behaviour and changing their ways, it's okay, and they will live with that, but we all know that it's not a long-term solution, and how we can move them with the job into a more permanent accommodation is really critical. I will say that surprisingly what we learned through this project is that many offenders that actually continue with jobs do tend to build relationships with families again far better than they did previously when they weren't in that position where they had a job and a purpose, which has been reassuring. We had a very local employer that took a young man into his workplace, and this young man, first time in custody, had 2 very young children, and his grandmother decided that she'd allow him to live at her house because he'd got a job and he wasn't going to be under her feet all the time, etc., etc. So the job created the solution to him not having any accommodation. And again, he accessed the bursary to actually clear a little bit of universal credit overpayment debt so that he was in a better place. And that then encouraged his wife to understand his commitment to his job and his future. And she wasn't going to be put in a disadvantage with her own situation financially. And she took him back. So, you know, there have been sort of situations where we have found that the job has been a big solution. I will say that, you know, this is by no means us working in isolation. The partnership work that goes on in Norwich especially, and in Norfolk, it's absolutely phenomenal, and it's not through lack of trying. You know, people are desperate and committed to trying to help offenders actually get their ducks all in a line. Yeah. So the partnership and the will is there. It's just a really tricky place to be.
Yeah, thank you. Ross, you've raised your hand, the little yellow hand.
I have, yes. I suppose this could be quite an easy fix, to be perfectly honest. We in King's Lynn are very different to Norwich. I think most of the prisoners being released are probably Norwich residents. So they've got a slightly bigger problem. I know that Norwich, and I think possibly the Greater Norwich Partnership, have a prison release protocol in place. That doesn't extend to any of the other local authorities. Thinking about the issue that you've raised in relation to accommodation, prisoners being released with employment, I mean, that doesn't happen very often at all, to be perfectly honest, and that's absolutely fantastic if it does. I think potentially there's easier ways to get round this, either direct lets from housing associations or quite a minor amendment to the allocations policy to allow priority for prisoners being released with employment. I believe, if I remember correctly, that employment was a reasonable preference category as well for allocations policies. I think probably a lot of housing associations would already have it, safe surrender policies in place for people entering prisons. So if people haven't got that as a collective, that's something that potentially needs to happen. But within King's Lynn, we don't see many people, so it could be either direct lets or an amendment to the allocations policy. And maybe if before a prisoner's actually released, whether a property is sought before they're released, but then you've got the issue in relation to rent on a property, and would housing associations potentially take a hit of the weekly rent pending the release of that person?
As Mantress, would you be changing your allocations policy as you suggest?
We need to do an overhaul of our allocations policy, so it's something that we could look at. I mean, the numbers of prisoners with employment being released are going to be so small that it's not really going to have a massive impact. I think probably Norwich would have maybe a slightly different take because of the pressures on them, but I wouldn't see that as a massive issue. I know that we've got Lisa Grice on the line as well. I don't know what your thoughts are, Lisa.
I was trying to think now. It's a difficult one. I mean, we have a very, very small amount come through to North Norfolk on release from prison, so we'd have to do some quite major change with our allocation policy, but we would work with anybody coming through, and we always do to try to and look at their preference on the housing waiting list and see what we can do to support them.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I've really just made reference to social housing there, and I think over the discussions you've said about private rented accommodation, we understand how difficult that is to get. Please bear in mind that local authorities have a homelessness prevention fund in place as well, and if you've got Ministry of Justice money or funding from elsewhere, then we can potentially assist with that as well, with building up that funding.
That's a good point. Very good point. Maria, you've just written something in the chat. Do you want to talk to it?
Yeah, it was just about the Somewhere Safe to Stay hub, because obviously this is something that came down from the ministry funding, and it's been a little while getting off the ground, just due to planning issues, to be fair. It does have 14 bed spaces, and what that is really, it's an assessment centre. So what that means is you just should be going in for 72 hours. So if you do have someone that has a bigger plan and they've got more of a goal that they're working towards, this gives them that interim stopgap. And we don't want it, obviously we will be crushed if it's actually at full capacity within minutes of opening the door, because that will defeat the object altogether, but we're hopeful that it won't be. So that does give us that opportunity to take prisoners in. It, like I said, it won't be for everybody, but for many it will be a perfect stopgap while they put together their wide plan with whoever's supporting them to do so. So I think that's important, and also it's just worth sort of mentioning that over the winter months from December right through to March, in partnership with Norwich City Council, St Martin's have commissioned and block funded a hotel so that we can actually use that as a resource, so that we can, anyone who ends up on the street potentially is they can go into that hotel. So there are options out there at the moment, obviously for the winter. These are short-term solutions and not long-term solutions, but at least it's a safe.
As mantras, Mary, what percentage do you think of ex-offenders leave prison without any employment, and therefore wouldn't, you know, if we had that tweak on the allocation system, wouldn't qualify if they didn't have employment?
I think the prisons, we're not part of that KPI, but the prisons do have a KPI of what is expected of them as regards to releases coming out of custody with employment. So we're not part of that. We just assist them with that performance indicator. We're not targeted ourselves, and it's always been about the right thing at the right time for the person, like I've said. They also have an employment broker, which is the New Futures Network, who works with employers to support more employers getting involved and more employers actually going into prisons, etc., with more vacancies for offenders to apply for. I do need to stress that the project that we talked about, the New Life project with the fund, is available for all Norfolk offenders, regardless of where they live. So it would extend right over to King's Lynn. And we did have one offender that went to King's Lynn, actually, and Flagship were really good with that offender. They didn't actually need accommodation, they needed a job, but they were very, very work ready, and we just hadn't managed to secure the job very early on in their journey into the community, and they did some fantastic work, and that guy did get a Flagship, but Flagship were very, very supportive of him. And we do find that as well. It's not just the housing providers looking for accommodation. The housing providers are very open to supporting people as well, and we have to be very grateful for all the offers of support, because sometimes it's more than one thing that solves the problem. I think it's about 30% that the prison are expected to get people into work on release.
So the majority will leave, not necessarily with employment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose it's really important for us to think of that group as well.
Absolutely, because many of those will have a lot longer on their journey to employment. You know, they might have the skills, you know, there's all sorts of things like Vicky spoke about: mental health, physical health, well-being, you know, contact with previous criminal behaviour, you know, it's peer support, it's probation sort of having a little bit of a hold on their risk in the community as well. And all of that is, you know, very important that we take all of those things into consideration. We don't, you know, we're not in the game to put employers or the community at risk. We are just doing the right thing, and we do work really closely with the partnerships to make sure that it's the right thing for the person as well.
Sue, do you want to come in with a question there? Rather than me just reading your question.
Yeah, I guess I was just saying, obviously we've got the big prison in Norwich, but a lot of the offenders there, ex-offenders there, won't be local people. So what proportion of them choose to stay in Norfolk? Do we know?
I think Vicky might help out her a little bit, but my understanding is that about 70 to 80% are Norfolk and Suffolk offenders in Norwich prison. And they're worth how they're operating right now because of COVID restrictions, etc., movement of offenders. But the idea is that they go back to a prison that's fairly close to where they intend to live to get released from that prison. But like I say, COVID's made a lot of things look very different at the moment.
And I think also, Mary, I think that figure's quite accurate. I think also we need to consider Wayland, and we also need to consider HMP Bure. And as Carolyn mentioned earlier, the women that are being discharged from Peterborough who have got quite a jaunt to get all their way back safely to Norwich. So Wayland Prison is a national resource. It's a training prison. However, I think they are discharging, I don't know, last time I looked, it's almost like 100 men a month back into Norwich. HMP Peterborough for women only, and also there'll be some men out of Peterborough too. They discharge approximately 12 women per month back into Norwich, and then HMP Bure I think is about 12 a month too. So yeah,
a lot of people.
And as Mary's alluded to with COVID, then there could well be some of our residents who are in Birmingham, for example, but can't be moved because of the pandemic. And Norwich is a local release prison for those wanting to resettle back into Norfolk and Suffolk.
I suppose I'm going to give the floor to Paul Kingston in a moment, but just a follow-on question to that is, you know, if you've got 100 people, I think it comes to about 124 people per month being released into Norwich, what percentage of that would actually already have accommodation through family, whatever it might be, and what percentage are regarded as in need of accommodation? Vicky, I don't know whether you can help with that.
Yeah, Leon would have all the statistics for that, and Paul Reeve, they'll be able to put their hands on that in a nanosecond, but I don't have access to that. But there is data that helped informed our business case for our project, but that might be a little bit out of date now.
Right, useful. Paul, you wanted to ask a question. You're on mute, I'm afraid. That's the first time I've said it in the meeting. I'm feeling quite pleased with ourselves.
Sorry about that, Michael. Yeah, when you were asking about the percentage of people that leave prison with a job, I went in search of the internet, and the Ministry of Justice say that only 17% of ex-offenders manage to get a job within a year of release. So it's that figure is a lot smaller than the third that was just mentioned there. 3 out of 4 people would be comfortable buying from a business that employs ex-offenders. Ex-offenders who get a job after prison are 9 percentage points less likely to reoffend. And 81% of people think that businesses employing ex-offenders make a positive contribution to society. And 86% of employers of ex-offenders rate them as good at their job, which I think is well noteworthy. And 92% of employers think that their firm's reputation's been enhanced by the diverse recruitment. And it's quite interesting, you know, some of the statistics nationally on that.
You had a question earlier, which I missed actually, Paul. Do you want to? Yeah, sorry, I'll come back for Mary in a moment. But you were asking a question about Ipswich earlier, which I missed. But let's give Mary a chance to respond to that, and then I'll come back to you, Paul, for a follow-up.
I think it's really interesting because the Ministry of Justice, I think, what I'm saying, are the ones that set the targets for the prisons around their KPI around discharge of offenders going into employment. So it's quite interesting to see the difference between what actually happens to the target that the prisons are set, which is quite interesting as well. But what you will see, feedback from employers that take on an offender, they usually say they're very loyal, hardworking people. And if you speak to an offender that's been in employment for a while with a particular employer, they don't want to go anywhere else. They don't want to apply for jobs anywhere else because they've got to go through the whole disclosure thing. And it's that thing where they can never take that monkey off their back. So that they absolutely, once they are in employment, they tend to become very loyal, hardworking employees because they just don't want to revisit that place where they're going through, you know, disclosure and all of that stuff again.
So I'm going to come back to you, Paul, for to talk about Ipswich, and then I want to, following dealing with that question, move to Leslie, if I may, giving Leslie some warning. So, Paul.
Yeah, so Michael, I asked the question in the chat, but I think Vicky answered it partially by signposting me to Anglia Care Trust and Solo, who are doing something. So I'm happy with that.
You're content that there's stuff going on in Ipswich.
Yeah.
So Leslie, I'm afraid you don't get a long time to think about what you're going to say. I'm handing over to you.
No, well, I think I just made my point really is that we've been talking about people leaving prison with employment, which is amazing, which is, you know, is would obviously be the ideal situation, but a lot of the 70% of we said obviously don't, and may still be in quite a complex position in their life. And often I was just making the point really that what we don't have is we have provision in terms of support, but what we don't have is provision in terms of accommodation, that we are able to place the most complicated individuals safely for that short period of time to help them move on. So yeah, I think your question, Michael, was how can social landlords support that, make that more open for people in more complex cases. I mean, Maria, and obviously the hostels do provide that, but some people are just in a very, very complex state, and if they don't have access to suitable medical provision and adult social care support, it makes it very, very difficult for them to accommodate them. So that would be another quick win, I think, to be able to have better joined up working and just to be able to secure people into that accommodation before they come back round again.
Yeah, completely agree. Some interesting points being made in the chat. Maria is making the point which I think probably has to be a message to all of us, to be good examples, which I see that Mary agrees with. So I don't know whether you want to talk to it, either of you want to talk to that point.
I can just say that we don't have a policy specific around it in St Martin's, but we're very open to recruiting people who have got colourful histories. And actually we find it really is a good message, because one of the things that I find frustrating is how can we tell someone who's struggling to find employment that, you know, it's an open market and you can go in and find a job, and we're not actually prepared to do it ourselves. So I think it's really good for them to see, and they generally because we have people who've had a history of service use in St Martin's as well, you know, from years ago maybe, but people know that and they respect that, I think, and I think it makes a big difference in that communication and support.
I would be really interested to know from perhaps Mary or perhaps Katie, if she's still on the call, about if you're an employer that's looking and willing and able to take on offenders and they're leaving prison shortly, how do you advertise the roles to make them available, if that makes sense? What should we be doing? Because it's probably too late if we're just putting an advert into the EDP or on the web somewhere.
There are 2 or 3 schemes. One is called Ban the Box. So at the point of making an application, you don't disclose. And that one is really quite useful, because you then get to speak through your situation at interview. So you're not asked about a previous, you know, DBS check, etc. Until you go to interview. So you're on an open playing field to get to interview, which is really useful, and it's been quite successful in the past. We actually do respond to some employers that actually ring fence opportunities for different disadvantaged groups, and, you know, ex-offenders just being one of those disadvantaged groups, and they can do that through positive discrimination sort of rules and regulations, etc. But usually it's more a case of we are open to anyone sort of thing, and employers making that sort of statement up front encourages people with additional sort of concerns, barriers, preconceived ideas around recruitment to actually employ apply for those jobs. I think the biggest problem is the fear of disclosure. People find it really difficult to disclose. They don't know how to do that in a positive way, which is why usually the best results for disclosure happen inside custody, because the barrier's already down. You know, the first thing you say to some men that are sitting there waiting to go for an interview is the employer already knows you've got a criminal record. They are in prison. They are here because they are interested in you becoming part of their workforce. So it breaks down the barrier. When they're the other side of the gate, they find it more difficult.
Which makes complete sense. How do we advertise jobs inside the prison service?
We do that ourselves.
Right, so we do it through you. So we let you know that jobs are coming up, and because I think that's an important takeaway for all of us to think about.
Yeah, even through now through COVID times, we've got a footprint within the prison, so we've got a route in and a route out. and we send newsletters, etc. And the prison's resettlement teams are already identifying people that they match and then send over a referral to Katie, and they pick them up through a phone call or sort of facilitated phone call or something like that. So there's an awful lot going on in that space.
Also, sorry, just to add on to that, but pre-COVID, we went to all of the workshops within the prison. Every single workshop in the prison was covered, and because we've built up those relationships with the workshop instructors, I still have contact with them, and so we send a lot of information to them as well, so that they can spread it out, because all the workshops in the prison are still ongoing. It's just that we're not physically there at the moment. So we do have the like Mary said, the footprints with the staff, but we also have really good relationships with the workshop instructors. So they advertise a lot out for us as well.
That's really useful, and I think there's something for us to build on. I'm loving the fact that Paul Kingston is managing to be in the session and also on the internet at the same time, and has challenged us actually. The MOJ website says only 400 businesses are registered with them as ex-offender friendly, and wonders how many housing providers are in that list. And I'm pretty sure that not as many as there should be, and it may well be your article that you're just about to write, Paul, in Inside Housing. We'll encourage people to volunteer. Because I'll be very honest, I didn't know that there was a scheme to be ex-offender friendly with the MOJ. So that's something for us to look at. I can see someone's got their hand up, but I just don't know who it is.
It's Simon.
Hi.
Simon.
No, it feels like we're on off tangent, so the moment's lost. But
no, bring us back. We've got another 20 minutes before
surely the type of offence would come into play. I mean, like, this is a pretty obvious question, I'm guessing. But how do you rate the different types of people, the reason they were in jail in the first place, in terms of offenders getting back into the workplace?
So really for us is managing risk. It's not our risk, it's the employer's risk. So it's about open disclosure, and the employers will have their own policies and risk assessments that they will factor into their business. So if an employer comes to me and says, actually, my risk assessment says I'm unable to do this, especially for early people, soon out of custody, and their risk is probably a little bit higher than if they can say they've been crime-free for a year or something like that, then we make that quite clear to the candidates that put their name forward, and we have that honest conversation to say, actually, the employers are saying right now the nature of your offence is something that they can't take on to their business. And we listen to what the employers tell us, and we sift accordingly and make that well and truly understood, because we all know that there are risks that some employers can't get round, there are some that they can, and it's all about what the employer tells us that they have to deal with.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a really good point, though.
I can give you a slight example there.
Please.
About 4 years ago now, I've done a lot of work with Bernard Matthews, and they actually, it's quite tricky, but they actually did in the end decide to come into prison to interview offenders, and they still do that to this day after 4 years. They continuously do this. Every month they come in and they do a recruitment session. But early days, one of their biggest concern was around knife crime, because the factory has lots of sharp knives involved in their business, and they were very, very risk averse to knife crime. But gradually, as time's gone along, they now listen to the person and they ask the person. They're not interested in a CV, they're interested in disclosure, because they say they can give the people the skills that they want. They're more interested in the disclosure. What did you do? When did you do it? And why did you do it? And what are your plans for your future? And it's an open conversation that they have with the offenders now, as opposed to looking at a list of things that they have done or haven't done as such. And they are nowhere near as risk averse to knife crime now as they were early days.
And as a manager, did you put in support with Bernard Matthews? I mean, as an employer, I guess you're thinking through all the potential offences that might be regarded as borderline in terms of your own business. Do you give but a lot of our knowledge will come more from the media than actual factual knowledge.
Yes.
So do you give support to employers who are thinking about becoming ex-offender friendly as to which roles in their organisation would be suitable and which perhaps may not be from a risk point of view?
Yeah, obviously we listen to the employers, and they will have their own risk, assessments and policies in place, and we just will help the employers make sure that the right candidates sit in front of them, and we mainly do this simply because it's not fair on either point. We don't want people sitting in front of an employer just to be told you're rejected. That's not a good place to be either. So we manage that risk with the employer. Yeah.
I was thinking more of coaching employers to not be too risk averse, because it's easy to be too risk averse. You're not going to get told off by boards, etc. If you're risk averse, but you've got to find the right point on the risk scale, haven't you? Where it's an acceptable and it's a risk you can manage. Are there any more comments, questions, challenges? I think we've been given quite a few challenges this afternoon. I do think there's the issue for us as a sector as to how much we're a blockage. And I really like the idea of checking allocations and working out how we can work on that. But I'm also extremely conscious there's an awful lot of people leave prison without a job to go to. And their housing need is extremely high, and it almost makes it more likely that there will be reoffending. I think there's a message for us as employers, and I think we could all take that back to our organisations about how ex-offender friendly we are. And what we'll try to do is follow up after this session and try to circulate some useful information or websites that people can go to. And I'll feed that through back into Homes for Cathy as well. We've got 115 housing associations who are members of Homes for Cathy. It would be interesting to see if any of them are on that MOJ list of friendly employers. I suspect we're not doing very well on that. Are there any other points that people particularly want to talk about this afternoon, or just would like to mention? I think that's a no. Oh, no, there's a hand up. Maria.
I just wanted to go back to the issue of the private sector, because, you know, we're all very good at coming up with solutions and working with each other, but the private market doesn't really engage with us on that process unless someone can tell me differently. Because I know in Great Yarmouth they had a group of landlords that could get together and have these discussions. Is there any forum like that we can actually get involved in, where we can, I don't know, sort of debunk some of the myths around offenders or homelessness and all that with landlords, and try and find out what it is they want us to do to actually have us use their properties? I don't know if anyone's doing anything around that.
It's a good question. No, silence seems to be prevailing. So I think that's another takeaway that we ought to be thinking about as to whether we could actually establish something in some way. Vicky, thank you very much. I can see you're leaving the meeting. Thank you very, very much indeed for your participation this afternoon. And I'm sure we will be following up. I thought I saw a hand go up as well. Was that Paul? I had to turn off the chat to be able to see who's lifted hands. Paul Kingston. You're coming back with more information from the internet?
No internet. No, this is based on experience. So in answer to Maria's question about private rented sector, a very good friend of mine is a very big private landlord operating in the Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft area. And I can tell you now, he does not shy away from rehousing offenders. Based on previous discussions I've had with him, he's had lots of experiences with people that have offended in his properties. So that's just one small example. He owns about 160 properties, so he's no small fish.
Yeah, I think that's what I was referring to. I knew that there was some good work that had been done in Great Yarmouth around this, but I'm working, obviously I'm talking about Norwich specifically, and the private sector is tied up by the universities, the hospitals. There's no need for them to go out to our sector to look for tenants. So it's just really about how we get around that in this area. And I don't know, but maybe the other districts may be having some similar problems, but Norwich specifically has a real challenge around it. But there may be examples from Great Yarmouth that we could maybe get some advice from your colleague and your friend and see if there's anything that we can take from what he does and what he knows and the connections he possibly has by working in that field.
That's a really good idea. I think there's something for us to take away there. I've realised I missed picking up on Daryl's comment earlier, Daryl Smith. Daryl, are you still on the call?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Sorry, Michael.
Don't worry. I just wonder whether you want to talk about the challenge with younger people more
Well,
generally.
I think it was one making the statement that young people, and it's a cliche to say young people are different to the wider population. I think they bring their own challenges, and certainly through COVID. But I think it's just recognising at the present moment in time, young people have been disproportionately affected through this current crisis around employment. So being young, being a young offender and finding employment is actually a real struggle at the moment. So it's recognising that it's not just about being offender for them, their age aspect comes into that. And their lack of experience in the workplace plays out through the challenges of them tapping into the workplace as well. Yeah. So what I would say is, while we're advocating for being enrolled in jobs for offenders, the other way of doing that for younger people is making sure that through the Kickstart programme, you are looking at young people that might be young offenders and giving them that opportunity to do work experience in the workplace. So if any of you haven't engaged in that programme, that is another way of looking at young offenders and their opportunity to get work experience at least. Right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Daryl. Points well made. Paul, have you got a hand up again, or has it just not come down? It's down. So I think we'll close a few minutes early. Can I say thank you very much indeed? It's been a really interesting and useful conversation. I think we've probably all got quite a few takeaways that we need to think about in our own organisations to make sure that we're part of solutions, not part of problems. Thank you particularly to Mary and Katie for speaking, and also thank you to Vicky, but she's already left. I really appreciate that, and also everybody else who's made contributions this afternoon. There will be a recording of this, which Paula will make available to people, but we'll also going to try to do a write-up of the key points, and we'll include within that any signposting that we need to do and any links. If people have think after this meeting, gosh, I really think everyone should look at such and such a website or whatever it is, can you please feed those through to Paula, and she'll ensure that we circulate that feedback and that useful information in our write-up. I'm not going to make a promise as to how quickly Paula and team will write it up. I'm waiting to see if Paula's now taking herself off mute to tell us that it will all be there. No, she's not. So we'll do it as quickly as we possibly can. Is that what you're saying, Paula?
I was definitely saying as quick as I possibly can. Yeah.
And how quick is that, as my interest?
I'll try to get it done
for a friend.
All right. I'll try to get it done for next week. It's just that the download from home takes hours, literally.
Yes, it's amazing. The last 8 months have taught us that the internet is a utility, not a luxury. And there's certain pockets of Norfolk where I haven't seen somebody in focus now for 8 months. I think we all suffer a bit from that. But thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thanks for attending, and I hope to see you again all soon. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.